What if fundraising's not just about the bottom line? What if it is about who you become and what you believe in the process? And what if the journey is bigger than you and your ministry?
Welcome to Season 4 of It's Not About the Money. Join us as we examine elements of ministry fundraising through the unique lens of personal formation. Let's dive in.
Welcome back, everybody. We are headed into our second episode for the mini-series on church partnerships. And today, I'm excited because we are going to dive into Scripture and take a look at how we see partnership represented and God's provision represented in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So if you're familiar with the original Provisio curriculum, we do address the biblical foundation for fundraising in that space, emphasizing that it is always God who is providing, but that provision can often come through our obedience in inviting others to partner with us. Today, we want to focus specifically on God's provision through the collective, through the people of God in the Old Testament, which would be Israel, and through the people of God in the New Testament, which is the church. So, I'm joined again today by Corey and Andy.
Hello.
Let's just dive in and take a look first at the Old Testament. So, Corey, where do you see the collective providing for God's people? And then, Andy, you can jump into.
Yeah, so the first place that I would like to start is the Levites. And so Levites started with Aaron. And so in Numbers, God told Aaron that he and his descendants were not going to have any inheritance in their land, and that they were not going to work the land or own land, and that God was going to give to Aaron and the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance instead of land. So,
which is a big deal because other tribes in Israel are given land, like space to own.
Right.
So in the ancient world, land was considered like a safety net because it was how you provided for yourself. It was how you survived, how you ate. It was your inheritance, what you gave to your kids. But God was saying, I have something greater for you. So in return for the work that you're going to do while you're serving at the tent of meeting, I'm going to provide the tithes from the Israelites' land. So the other Israelites were using their land to provide for the Levites. And so the Levites were not working what we would call a normal job of tilling the earth, tending the sheep,
Right.
all of that. But they were laboring at the tent of meeting, and their needs were still being met because there was a equal partnership between the Levites and the rest of Israel. So the Levites were serving Israel by providing a place for them to meet with God and to experience his presence and his forgiveness. But the Israelites were also serving the Levites by providing offerings and food. So both groups, when they were both living in obedience, they were both provided for by God.
All right, so we're starting with the Levites. Andy, you have anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because the main body of Israel is offering these sacrifices and they're worshiping God. And the priests are also worshiping God by taking those sacrifices and following all of these very strict guidelines and then burning these things and doing all the things in the right way. That's their worship. As a result, the priests are provided for. Like there's portions in there that says like this portion is set aside for Aaron and for the people that are serving in the tabernacle. And then Israel is also being provided for because when they're in obedience, they are receiving blessing. So it's this nice triangle, right? You have the Israelite who is worshiping God, you have the priest who is worshiping God, but there is a horizontal benefit as well, and that the priest is being taken care of. And the same is true for missionaries as well.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think it was really interesting to see that the Levites didn't just survive. They didn't just get by on this plan that God had for them. They thrived. Like God made sure that they had enough so that they could even tithe. So they were receiving tithe, but then they tithed from the tithe.
Yeah.
And so that has always been interesting for me to see churches who, they receive tithe from their congregation, but then some churches will tithe their tithe.
Yeah, this nice ripple effect.
Well, and I think about how, so we recently, or Earlier this year, we did a series on soundtracks, the things we believe and how that really matters. And it occurs to me that at any point in this, for them to just get a little bit off in their thinking, for example, going back to how, one of my kids would be like, that's not fair. Like starting with God's division of labor and care, if they kind of got stuck in this thinking of like, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to depend on the other parts of Israel? Why can't I, whatever. Or even with when they receive, to have the thinking of, why do I have to tithe on top of this? I'm already doing the Lord's work or whatever. There's just so many places that not just submitting to God's design would really affect everybody.
Yeah. And there clearly was a temptation to do that.
Right. Well, because they're people.
Right. And there were the tribes before they had taken over, before they had crossed the Jordan and continued to rout the natives in the original conquest, right? There was the tribes that had kicked out people to the east of the Jordan. And they just wanted to kind of say, can we just stay here? But Moses or Joshua.
Well, if it's in the promised land, it's Joshua.
It's Joshua.
Yeah.
Came to them and said, listen, we need promises that, yeah, you can stay here, but when we call you to fight, we need you to fight.
Oh, yeah.
We need you to come back to us, knowing that the temptation would be, you know what, we're good. You guys go do your thing. We did our thing. You guys go do your thing. We'll do us. You guys do you, and we'll just kind of thrive. So yeah, it's clearly a human thing that we're working against.
Yeah. Okay, so we've definitely got the example of the Levites and the collective's care for them as defined by the Lord. And then a little bit later in the Old Testament, I feel like we come up on some other examples, some other ways to see it with the building of the temple and the distinction in the provision for priests and even full-time laborers. So I'd love to hear you speak to that and where that is.
Yeah, so that's in 2 Kings 12. So Joash was king at that time. And so he had the idea to rebuild and repair the temple that had been pretty dilapidated. And in this passage, there was actual money involved, as compared to land in the last passage. So they actually had a box set up next to the altar where money could be collected. And with that money, they paid the laborers who worked on the temple, those who were repairing the temple. So the carpenters, builders, masons, and stone cutters. So they had a division of how the money was used. So there was, money from the animal sacrifices went to the priests, but then the money that was in that box at the altar was used for the temple workers. And it was interesting that nobody worried about where the money was going because 2 Kings 12, verse 15 says they acted with complete honesty. So all the money got exactly where it was supposed to go.
It's interesting that the author chooses to emphasize that. It's almost like this is special. This is abnormal that people will just do this and just leave the money and trust that it'll be used faithfully.
I mean, that is very striking because these days, we have whole companies that come in to audit ministries and make sure they're using their money rightly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I wonder if they had an audit back then and if that's how they could say it was used rightly. I wonder
right.
how they came to that.
Or that God blessed them.
Is there anything else we want to say about that?
So I think if we kind of apply that to today, we could see the priests, those who were working on the sacrifices, as those who work directly for the church today, like pastors. And then we can see the workers as, full-time laborers, cross-cultural workers, missionaries, etc. So these two groups of people are complementing each other. So the external full-time workers serve to build up the church by bringing new members into God's family, planting new congregations, and going out, being sent out, kind of apostolic, while the internal workers are nurturing the flock inside the church. They're shepherding the church. The two groups are never in competition with each other. In this passage, there was enough money to go around for everyone to do what they were called to do. The priests were even commanded by King Joash to raise and to gather that money for the full-time laborers. If we make a direct connection at something that we should see pastors doing within the church, would encouraging their congregations to financially support missionaries in addition to tithes that people are already giving to support the pastors.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a really good correlation.
And I think in both cases, and even in modern day cases, the reason for the financial help is to free up the people that are doing ministry to focus on ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have to worry about, in the Levites, they don't have to worry about tending the sheep and pulling weeds. They can really focus on this stuff. And in the example of in Kings, the priests can keep doing their jobs while the laborers are doing their repairing. And I'm curious, my assumption would be that the laborers are not necessarily from the tribe of Aaron like the priests would be. So anybody could be a laborer in this case. So that's kind of nice that it opens up the door for participation in ministry.
Well, and just thinking about, we're going to talk about tent making in a bit when we talk about New Testament and kind of like where does that fit in. But to your point, it's really a gift that, the priests were able to devote their time to what they had been called to. And in the same way, the laborers were able to devote their attention to the rebuilding of the temple. Because I don't know if you guys have ever had a friend or something help you with the home project. They're just kind of doing it in their spare time. Or even if you get a professional, they're kind of doing it for free in their spare time.
They got other things that are pulling on their attention.
Or even ourselves, in projects where we just kind of do it on the side after we tend to our real work. It's a very different thing than if you're able to just devote yourself to that thing. And so for the laborers, it's just really beautiful that we see that as they devoted themselves to the rebuilding of the temple, they were provided for.
And there's nothing wrong with tent making, but there is a shift in maybe even just the amount of time or the ratio of time that you can give towards ministry and just spending time in relationship versus, you have to kind of make a little bit of money right now to live off of.
Yeah. All right. So let's pivot to the New Testament. We've already kind of, waded into those waters, talking about the church and sending and providing, but I'd love to hear some of your initial thoughts on how we see this play out in the New Testament.
I was kind of overwhelmed when I started digging and realizing how much raising support is in the New Testament. So I would start with Philippi. So the church at Philippi supported Paul financially in his work, and they did that more than once because Philippians 4:16, Paul says, "He sent me aid more than once when I was in need." And then I think that he might be referencing the Levite sacrifice because he calls the gifts a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice.
Yeah.
So Paul, he thanks his partnering church in Philippi by basically de-emphasizing the gift itself and elevating the result of the gift. And he calls it the fruit that increases to your credit as a result. Because for Paul and the Christians in Philippi, it wasn't just about the money, it was about their participation in God's work. So it's a true partnership because God was basically crediting the good work accomplished through Paul to the Philippian church.
I really love that emphasis, not on the gift, but the fruit of the gift. Because essentially that's the why. And that's what we're always trying to coach people towards, having their own kind of vision and gaze locked on. Obviously locked on Christ. And then aside from that, the why. Why is God asking you to do this? And how that's much better for the formation of your heart than focusing on the money.
And this came up for me as well when I was kind of researching these topics. So I pulled this up. So maybe I could just read this.
Sure.
For our listeners who don't have a Bible handy or they're in the car or whatever. So this is Philippians 4:15 through the end of the section here. So it's 5 verses through 20. So bear with me, but I think it's all good. And you Philippians know that in the early days of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent gifts for my need several times. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the profit that is increasing to your account. But I have received everything in full, and I have an abundance. I am fully supplied, having received from Epaphroditus what you provided, a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God. And my God will supply all your needs according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. Now to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. And I was tempted not to read that last verse, but I think that's important too, because this is all for his glory.
Mm-hmm.
All of this synergy, all this interaction, all of this giving and receiving. And hey, listen, you're going to give to me, but you're also going to have everything that you need, all for his glory.
That's so good. And, I think that 4:19 is such a common verse, like, my God will meet all your needs according to his riches. And sometimes we take that verse out of context and we apply it only to those of us who really need the money, who are raising support. But I mean, this verse is in the context of being written to a partnering church that's full of recurring donors.
Yeah.
So we can bless our supporting churches when we remind them, as they're giving, God will supply their needs.
And dipping back into Elijah, right? Like the widow, not only did she provide for him, but God provided for her. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that we just come up again and again on this idea that it's really for the benefit of all. It's for the formation of all.
Mm-hmm.
I'd really like to, I don't know, we've emphasized it before, but I'd like to just again reiterate, like, how is it formational for everybody involved? Like, from what you just read, what is that doing for all parties?
You want to go first, Corey? I have some thoughts, but I think at the heart of it, and this is just cutting to the chase, but I think it helps both parties to release control when we live in dependence. And that is just something that we struggle with in our flesh. I want to be in charge. I want to be in control. And it's not just Americans. It's part of the human condition. And so one of the ways that we express that control is our finances. And it just feels right to have our savings account and have our ducks in a row and our storehouses, and then to expand our storehouses. Right. But
it gets dangerous.
It gets dangerous. And I think for the donor and the donee, the recipient, there's that interdependence that I think is super helpful. It's super formational, where the missionary is depending on God, but also depending on that donor. And then the donor is depending on the Lord to give, as they give sacrificially, like, I had this allocated for that new car or for whatever, even something good for an emergencies, but I feel like the Lord is leading me to give to you. That releases your locus of control and shifts it in a very healthy way.
Yeah. So true. I feel like it's really formational in the building of our faith, because we are stepping out in faith, tangibly, practically watching God provide. And then we have those stories, kind of like an Ebenezer to build our altar, to look back, collecting all of our memories of how God has provided for us. I mean, I just have so many stories from, my time fundraising of how God provided for me. And now, even though I'm not fundraising anymore, when I'm in need, or, I'm not sure what to do and facing the unknown, I look back to those stories and I remember God is going to provide for me, and God met me then, he's met me now.
Right.
Yeah.
It goes back to that. I brought it up many times before, but like that idea from one of my clients, I think every Christian should fundraise at some point in their life, because it's just so humbling and so wow, I can't do this on my own.
Yeah. And it just invites you into really seeing, my provision always comes from the Lord.
Yeah.
Regardless. Even when there's the pretense of the control of a paycheck or whatever, it's always from the Lord.
It's good.
So I guess maybe like thinking of the church specifically, like in church partnership, what are some ways that a church stepping into obedience in supporting the laborer, how is that formational for the church? I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to mind for me is that in ownership, there's always an opportunity to see the fruit and like offer up gratitude, praise, awareness, right? Because when you have ownership of something, you're very aware of what's happening with it.
You're invested in it.
Yeah, you're invested. That's a great word.
Yeah. So if you're attending church and you just hear about a missionary update on a Sunday, but you have no direct connection with that person or individual, and you don't give to that person, that's nice information and that's informative, but you don't feel a stake in what they're doing and in their success, or if they're struggling, or like, that's kind of like, yeah, I'll pray for them, but wow, no, I'm investing in that person and probably the more sacrificially invested you're giving, the more invested you are.
Well, and even from the church side, if there's somebody in your congregation that has gone as a missionary, but the church isn't necessarily behind them, the church isn't going to bring it up as much.
Exactly.
Like it will just be dependent on that person when they come home asking, can I talk to the church? Versus the church having ownership, or the church, I guess I'm saying church, but I mean like church leadership, the shepherds, whomever, the missions committee. If they have ownership of that person, it's going to be on their mind to be talking about that person.
Yeah. It's like this person is still a member. They're just a satellite member. They're just a member abroad.
So, I mean, I think there are so many benefits to partnering with a church. But Corey, I'm curious, in your experience in being sent and in coaching, what keeps people from valuing partnership with the local church or seeing it as necessary? What are the common perceived barriers or obstacles?
Oh, there are several. I think it often takes more time.
Yeah.
You have to build a deeper relationship. It's not a one-on-one, person-to-person relationship. I think you have to have more advocates to get where you need to be. You need to have more conversations. So that's why it takes time, because each conversation builds on another. You tell your Sunday school class leader, hey, I'm raising support. And they put you in touch with the missions committee. And then you tell the missions committee. And then they put you in touch with a pastor and you tell the pastor. It could take months to have all of those conversations. So I think that it can feel a little daunting to some people because they might not be sure where to start.
Does it feel like the decision time is multiplied a factor of how big the church is or how many people are in the room trying to make the decision or trying to decide on something?
I think it could be. Yeah, because there's so many people who want to weigh in on a decision. I think I've found that with smaller churches, it's a lot faster processing time.
And maybe if you're a new missionary, you're just intimidated if you're in a mega church. Wow, I've seen this person on stage. Who am I to go and say, can you support me? Or I can see that being an obstacle.
Well, and I wonder if, just like people really do need to be bought in, that when they approach individuals, it is a partnership and it's not just about the money. And it feels just as important to be very bought into the good and right place the church has, as opposed to it just being a strategy to approach churches, And
maybe the extent to which what is driving the church. What is the heartbeat of the church? Because every church kind of has its own angle or approach. We're all gospel-centered, but we all have maybe this particular part of the world or ministry that we're really passionate about. So if you're aware of that, you can help them to see how your ministry is connected to that. I think that's helpful.
And as we've talked about before, even if your ministry isn't connected to that, but you feel that you're supposed to approach them, that can sometimes generate conversations that kind of pivot and change the direction,
I mean, what's the worst that can happen?
Right. Yeah.
The worst that can happen is they say no, and everybody leaves still encouraged that, wow, I mean, you're still doing something good.
Right.
And this is awesome that part of our body is joining the mission field.
Yeah. And even though it's not something that the collective, the church can engage in, all those individual people might themselves want to,
Absolutely. Again, back to the big church thing, I think probably people see a big church and they see dollar signs sometimes. And I think those churches they're not just interested in writing checks.
Right.
They're interested in partnerships, usually, most of the time. So.
It's true.
I wonder what are some of the other false narratives or soundtracks we've been talking about that people have in their head, what is preventing them kind of mentally, emotionally from approaching a church?
I think some people may automatically assume just because they're not a member that they won't be supported. And I really am a big fan of people putting themselves out there with churches, because I had 12 churches that supported me. I wasn't a member at all 12 of those churches. Definitely not,
Right. Well, walk me through that, Corey. What is the process of walking into a brand new church that you don't have any kind of real relationship with?
That is definitely in the future modules.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's our next discussion.
Okay. So stay tuned.
Yeah, we go through the whole thing, how to do it, where to do it, who to talk to, all the stuff.
Okay. So we will answer that question.
Yeah. I think another false narrative or perceived obstacle that comes to mind, Andy, actually goes back to this idea that we talk about sometimes, the myth of the missionary hero. And I wonder if you're like sent by your church, if it feels even more, if there can be this false narrative that there's even more on the line for you to like not make a mistake or present really well or not dishonor your church.
Right. And then that just causes you, when you do have problems, to buckle down and bury them and maintain the facade.
Right. Which is so counter to the whole point of the church, right? Like,
and to the missions too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because in his grace to us, he gave us the local body to carry our burdens, to be a super safe, should be a super safe space to be messy.
Yeah.
Like in a room of people, we should be the first to raise our hands saying, I am not perfect. I do not have this all together.
Yeah.
So I need Jesus.
And maybe that's a message to the church. If you're at a church, you're not a missionary, you're in church leadership, just to not directly, of course, but even like be careful indirectly about putting any kind of unhealthy expectation on the polish and shine of your missionary, and just to uphold them. And I can kind of see that sometimes if you're a missions team or a committee, and we have all these standards and these check boxes that we're like, well, if you're going to be a missionary with us, then you need to meet all these requirements. And I think obviously you should vet people. You should see if they align with you and your mission. But the shadow side of that, I think, is that the missionary walks away thinking, I need to maintain this standard. And if I don't, they're going to pull the funding.
Yeah. Well, or even the best of intentions with the communications that go out to the church about your sent missionary, and how you talk about how hard their life is and how persevering. Like there's just all these ways that feel very honoring, but can unintentionally create an expectation that they need to be ironclad, or they're kind of the
last thing you want is for the congregation to see the missionary and say, I couldn't do that.
Yes. Yes.
Which happens a lot.
It happens a lot.
Happens a lot. Yeah. And it's a tension, right? Because I really do think that there's a space for really appreciating the sacrifices people make in glory to the Lord.
Right.
Right? Like we look at Paul and we're like, man, I respect and appreciate that this man like endured beatings and all of these things. Like glory be to God that Paul found him that worthy. And I do want to have a faith like that, right? So there's a tension in really like loving and respecting and honoring the good and beautiful things people do, and ultimately not making it about them, and not kind of putting on them that they are the one maintaining that.
And you have to be transparent if you're the missionary. You have to encourage that if you're the church. It has to be aspirational versus just inspirational. Like I want to aspire to be like that person, not just stand in awe. Because if you're standing in awe, you probably don't know the whole picture. You should be standing in awe of God.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting thing to parse out, just where inspiration kind of goes toxic, right? Because I was just even reading the story of Stephen, and I was just thinking about how, man, this guy was raised up because they were like, nobody's taking care of the widows. And the apostles are like, man, we got to appoint more people to help.
Right.
And then that's where Stephen is named. And then very next chapter is when everything goes sour for him, or actually not sour if you think about eternity with Jesus.
Physically painful.
It's physically painful, right? But it's like, but I think reading about his settledness and resolve, or at least, what we can take from that, it is inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's good. And I think like there is so much more in the New Testament.
Yeah, I had a lot of other examples. There's like 6 or 7 more examples, but I'll just name them quickly.
Yeah, then maybe the listener can go into more detail too, and do some self-research.
Yeah, for sure. So there's the church in Corinth. So Paul's giving a defensive support raising in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And he's asking them to reserve weekly tithes and get it ready so that he doesn't even have to make collections. When he arrives, it'll just be ready. There was a famine at that time in Judea. And so the Jewish world was really affected. The Gentile world, not so much. So the churches in the Gentile world, Paul was asking them to support financially the church in Jerusalem because they had this famine. They didn't have enough food. Oh. So, he asked the church in Galatia to do that, the church in Corinth. He writes to the church in Rome. I'm looking forward to you supporting me as I go to Spain. He's assuming they're going to send him to Spain. Yeah. And he tells the Roman church about Macedonia and Achaia, who have already given to the believers in Jerusalem. I think the thing that stuck out to me here is that there was cross-cultural giving between churches and between missionaries. And so you see there was maybe a rocky start of relating to each other with Gentiles and Jews, but eventually the Jewish and Gentile believers, they finally started living out this generous partnership with each other and sending missionaries from their churches. So Paul said, Romans 15:27, he said, if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with their material blessings.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And that earlier in that chapter is verse 15, where it's like, how can they preach unless they are sent? How can they hear that's good news? So that whole chapter is fantastic. I'm encouraged, though, that the takeaway for the modern world, I think, is that we need the global church today.
True.
Like what happened? Why does that change? Why are we content to kind of focus in on our own? Like we're shifting all of our currents internally versus relying on the global church. So not that that's true across the board, but let's re-engage that. We need our brothers and sisters. I guess what I see a lot of times is in the American church, we can be a little bit insular, myopic.
Yeah, so true. We, my church recently was planning to send a short-term team to Poland. And the church there, we're working with national. So they're not American missionaries. And we were going to bring a financial gift for them. And they said, you know what, just don't, we appreciate the offer, but please don't, because we really want to have our congregation learning to be self-supportive, but we we need your people, because I guess people are attracted by Americans coming, so they want to come and practice their English with the Americans. So to them, that's the gift.
Yeah,
and they would rather not be like just getting money all the time from American churches.
That's so good, because that can foster like an unhealthy dependence on the American church, right? Because my brother served in Mexico for 8 years, and what he saw was, I love short-term missions. In this scenario, a local church would kind of notice, well, the paint's kind of peeling on the church. Maybe we should do something about that. Well, why should we? There'll be another short-term group from America looking for something to do. We'll save it for them. It's reasonable, but it fosters a lack of ownership. And so I love that. That's what that Polish church was saying. It's great.
Yeah.
What other passages came to mind real quick?
The passage that talks about in 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul's giving his defense of support raising, he talks about receiving a living from the gospel, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about. But, the church had been accusing him that he was preaching the gospel in order to make money. And so, this goes with you brought up tent making, Heather, but, Paul is alluding to the Jewish priest who serves in the temple and he gets his food from the temple. And then he says in verse 14, in the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. And I wondered, that's a whole conversation in itself. Like, what does it even mean to receive a living from the gospel? And being confident as a missionary that that's what you should be doing,
And I think, you and I were kind of having a side conversation about that and just like where, he references the command, but where did that come from? And we came up with a few places that could point to. Do you want to share those?
Yeah. I don't have them in front of me. Do you have them in front of you?
I do actually have them in front of me. Yeah. So we see in Matthew 10:10 and Luke 7 that the worker is worth his wage. In 1 Timothy 5:18, we see counsel for paying preachers and teachers. And then, back in Deuteronomy, which obviously isn't New Testament, but that's okay. It's all one story written by God, where it references or where it speaks to don't muzzle the ox that treads the grain.
Yes, that's right.
I wonder if there's also like just a cultural understanding, like an undercurrent of this is what happens in society where a rabbi is reimbursed for his teaching or something. That isn't necessarily like everybody kind of understands that too. I wonder if there's some cultural things we're not getting to.
Yeah. But I do want to address tent making because that is something that can often come up, where people are, maybe they understand, there's a biblical basis for living on the support of others, but there's also a biblical basis for tent making and business as mission and things like that, right? Like Paul literally made tents. And so I think that's a really helpful thing for us to touch on. And I'm curious, I have some thoughts, wonder what you guys would want to say to that.
My initial thought as you were talking was, don't worry about us. We're not worried about keeping our jobs as fundraising coaches. If God is asking you to do business as mission, then do it.
Right. There's freedom.
There's freedom in that. So
I think what I've seen with the business as mission people is that they actually see all of the operational things that they do as a ministry.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So they actually, sometimes they'll need a CTO or a CFO, and that will be their ministry. Or, they'll be grinding coffee beans or making chocolate or whatever it is that they're doing in the 1040 window. And they're training local people how to do those things. And that's their ministry. And if they had gone into it with the idea of, I'm just going to be sharing with people about Jesus all day, and on the side, I'll support myself while I do this business, they would be sorely disappointed, But if they saw it more holistically as like, I'm going to go into the operations of this business, and this is going to be my life, and I'm going to live my life for Christ and share him while I'm doing these things, then that makes more sense for them.
Yeah, I have a personal example. We were in Asia as a family, and we attended the local international church where there was just kind of volunteer, leadership, because at an international church, the congregation is so transient. They're there for different reasons, for different amounts of time. But there was a lovely Australian couple, a little older than we were, and he was there in this country to run a business. Yes, he would come and preach. It was great. But he employed maybe like 100 plus local workers, and he saw his ministry to those people. And so he would have people translate for him, and he would bring in, he's very, very outgoing. He was very explicit and intentional about who he was and why he was there. So definitely saw his business as his ministry.
It reminds me of, education, because that's what we've all, we've done education in the past and in the 1040 window, and we went there. It's not a cover. It's an actual thing that we're doing for excellence, for the sake of providing excellent education, and that means so much to the local people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to that point, to that example that you gave, I'm aware that you can be paid and paid handsomely to go and teach overseas. And there are some organizations that you fundraise to be sent to teach overseas. And so for any of our listeners that get hung up on, well, maybe I could go in this capacity, or maybe I should go in this capacity, or is it more holy to go in this capacity, or whatever, I really think it just comes down to, what has God called you to? Is there a specific organization or a specific place that you feel that you're supposed to go to? What are your avenues to get there? There's freedom. You might go in a tent making capacity. You might go with payment from whatever entity, or you might go under the care of an organization that is set up in a way that your needs are met through the generosity of others. And I mean, I think it's just so important to not make that decision about the money because there's actually so much else to think through. Like, going through an organization, and I'm not trying to plug organizations, but the reality is that being sent by a faith-based entity is likely going to account for and provide for all kinds of things outside of the money, member care, international protocols for evacuating, like going under the care of someone can provide
a team.
Yeah. And into a team
Yeah.
that can provide so much non-monetary support.
Yeah. I think the question is like, what is the invitation?
Yes.
What is the Lord asking you to do? And what is your inhibition to that? What if Lord's asking you to do something, what's preventing you from doing that? And if he's asking you to serve with an organization, are you hesitant because you don't want to raise funds? In that case, I would say the invitation is to embrace that and wade into that.
Right.
Easier said than done.
Totally easier said than done. But here's the deal, guys. When has the call of God ever been as easy to do as it is to say?
Right.
Abraham literally went, not knowing where he was going. Esther literally went before the king, not knowing if she would perish.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The widow gave to Elijah, even though it was the very last bit. Like, it's never easy to do as much as it's easy to say.
If it was easy, then it wouldn't require faith.
Right.
Boy, that's so true.
And the point is, right, like the Great Commission isn't a suggestion. It's not an option. So regardless of what aspect of it, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, like you're called to do something, whether it's to go or to give, you got to do something.
Right.
So as we're getting a little bit long here, I don't know, Corey, are there some other passages that we can just reference real quick for people if they want to just kind of be a good Berean, study on their own time?
So Matthew 10:40-42, where Jesus says, whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And our pastor actually preached on this passage on Sunday, and he likened it to people feeling like they don't really have a place in the body of Christ or an important place because other people get to do the more interesting and exciting work, and all they do is just support. And so it was basically a sermon for everyone who supports. And he mentioned several passages, Old and New Testament, but one of the Old Testament ones he mentioned was where David's men, some are going into battle, some are staying with the baggage.
Yes.
And, they're saying, oh, well, those people who stayed with the baggage, they shouldn't get a reward. And David said they should get the same reward because they supported the troops.
Yeah.
And then also 3 John 5-8, John is encouraging the church to support missionaries that they don't even know personally. And so showing hospitality to people they don't know. And he said it was for the sake of the name that they went out, receiving no help from the pagans. We ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth. So even like I have had so many people who have shown me hospitality over the years, being in missions and full-time ministry. And lots of those people I did not know before they showed me hospitality. And I love that phrase, so we can work together for the truth. There's just an automatic connection with people who are willing to support, to stay back, to watch the baggage, to provide a house,
It is the unity of the body of Christ that is one of our leading testimonies to its fruitfulness and to its truth. It doesn't happen naturally. We're so tribal normally, but to I'm going to support this person that I don't know, or we're two strangers that are introduced to a team and suddenly we click. And everybody's like, oh, you've known this person for a long time. No, I just met them. The unity of the body of Christ is significant. And I love that little line, for the sake of the name. Again, it's all for his glory. That's the key for this whole thing, the giving, the receiving, the generosity, the going, the obedience, all for his name.
Yeah, so true.
Well, I hope that this conversation has done the work of encouraging the listener to push into the really beautiful examples throughout Scripture of the church in partnership with sent workers and in ministry to the glory of God.
And the last one I'll leave you with, dear listener, if you're still hesitant, look at Luke 8, verses 1 through 3, where you have an account of these women who are taking care of Jesus, that are giving to Jesus' ministry. And if anybody could have taken care of themselves, it's Jesus.
That's right.
But he modeled that for us.
He allowed himself to be supported, and by women, which in that day was quite taboo. Pretty amazing. And my final word would be that as missionaries, every time we share the gospel or help a new believer learn how to follow Jesus, our sending churches, through their support, are standing behind us. They're cheering us on, and they're receiving credit in the kingdom for the harvest. When we all stand before Jesus one day, Jesus is going to look at the church and say, thank you for this work in the harvest. And, as a supporting church, if you're a pastor listening to this, I hope that will really encourage you. And if you're a missionary, why would you ever hesitate to share an opportunity for a church to partner with you?
Amen. That's a good mic drop.
Yep, that is. Well, thank you, Corey, for being with us again. Thanks, Andy.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.